Happy New Year for 2019 and welcome back to Rod Suskin's World. The year is already underway, but it's time to have a look at what we can expect here in South Africa and a little bit about the rest of the world in 2019. 2019 is not a very critical year in terms of the great big cycles that are affecting us in the early 21st century. But it certainly represents the build-up to one of the most important cycles. Astrologers have been eyeing 2020 for some time. And there's a cycle, 2020, which really will go to 21 and 22 as well. But primarily 2020 is when it all really starts happening. So, to take our step back to 2019, 2019 then, we can say the theme of 2019 is that it is the ongoing slow build-up to the changes that we'll talk about next year, although I'm going to tell you a little bit about those important changes as well. In the early 21st century, there are two extremely important historical cycles that are pertinent to us. The one of 2012 and the one of 2020. So they are somewhat related, only just in terms of events, not in any astronomical sense. The cycles of 2020 were all about breaking down the old and opening up. And so we saw the collapse of many structures, most notably a lot of financial and political structures broke down tremendously in 2012 and the years leading up to it. Actually, there's a trigger cycle in 2008 which leads up to the 2012 one, and that's why the 2012 drama begins with the world stock exchange crashes and financial collapses from 2008 through 2012. So that's a period of new things that are scary, sometimes exciting, sometimes threatening, but it's a little bit like everything you knew is no longer true. And a lot of us did experience the early 2010s in that kind of a way. For better and for worse, we saw that in so many things. And in recent years, we've seen the lingering effects of that is because, of course, we made permanent social changes. Things that were acceptable in the past are no longer acceptable, and there's a lot of what is new sweeping the world. I will use one that interests me, of course, something like veganism, where it was pretty much impossible to imagine the kind of sweep of the appreciation of the destruction to the environment and the extreme animal cruelty that is associated with meat eating in the modern world. And that has rapidly begun to change just in the last year or 2 years or so. Whether we look at that or the legalization of cannabis increasingly over the world, or the increasing understanding and accepting of transsexuality and the variety of the human sexual experience, identity and self-expression. All that newness and so much more is the effect of the shake that happened to our world in the early 2010s. Now we're really at the end of all of that cycle. The end of that cycle, not to say that will stop, is the next step. And the next step is the reaction to it that is building up now. So the very important cycles of 2020, and we really mean January 2020, and that's why I want to talk about it, because it's the 18th of January. You know, we only get to talk about these things once January is really well underway. So we will see the cycles of 2020 developing rapidly after November of 2019. So I wanted to get in a few words about that now, and we'll talk, of course, as the year goes by and about that next year as well. While 2012 and 2008 were about the breakdown that leads to the new, 2020 is about the contraction due to the reactionary forces of the old. So, you know, we tend to think of history as an arrow, and it isn't. It's a cycle. We often have, because of our hope and our optimism, which are good things, We like to see the world as if everything's always getting better. Even if I talk about, say, veganism, people often say to me, consciousness is increasing. And it may be true that consciousness is increasing. The fallacy is to assume that there's no going back and that it just increases more and more. And of course, history shows that whatever increases, decreases, and increases again, and decreases and increases and decreases and increases are the nature of cycles and the nature of history. Hopefully, it's going to take a very long time to happen, but most of the cycles we're interested in are very small. So the cycle of 2020 has a period of around about 35, 40 years. They vary from time to time because they are not perfect circles that we are measuring. So planets move in ellipses, not in circles. So the cycles are a little bit more complicated. But the bottom line is that we are entering into a phase of contraction that we have seen a couple of times more, very notably in 1982 and more recently in 2001. But we have seen throughout the 20th century, of course, every 35 or 40 years or something like that, and different stages of the cycle as well. That's why there's only 20 years from 1982 to 2001. The different steps, of course, all cycles have along the way. So watching this cycle, the cycle of the great big planets of Saturn and Pluto, it is the cycle of conservatism. The philosopher, historian, astrologer Richard Tarnas describes this kind of thing as a period of contraction. He says these can be shown in history as eras of international crisis and conflict, the empowerment of reactionary forces and totalitarian impulses, organized violence and oppression, lasting traumatic effects. He says others have described it as the end of innocence, the destruction of an earlier mode of life that in retrospect might have been marked by indulgence, decadence, even naivety, but denial, and transformation through conservatism, conservation, reaction, crisis, and termination. He finishes his discussion by saying it often leads to the deployment of massive, highly disciplined, carefully organized, destructive power. Need I say more that this exact same cycle was there in 1914, the year, of course, of the beginning of the First World War, and 1939, the year of the beginning of the Second World War. So the four stages of the cycle, which are more frequent in 35 years, are often shown to be the trigger for wars. And astrologers do expect that 2020 will be characterized by war. It does look like it's a war that the United States is heavily involved in and might have more to do with the United States than Europe, which was the case of the previous world wars. And indeed, when we look at Donald Trump's charts after November of 2019, he looks increasingly like he is just going to start a war. I mean, from my look at his chart, it looks like that's what he wants to do. As we've seen with the current government shutdown in his country, it's like it's my way or the highway. And it's an aggressive stance that he is eventually going to lead to ways of looking for ways to start a war. We're not going to go too much into that, and we'll talk much more about that next year when we can see how those geopolitical forces are working. But what I really want to say about all of that is that in the years 2020 and 2021, astrologers expect massive violence, destruction and war. In the way that we've seen it before, it's not like unprecedented end of the world material, but it isn't looking good. 2019, we will increasingly see the build up to that. Trump's behavior, what's happening in the UK and Europe, as we see increasing disagreement and difference and reactionary forces clamping down. In fact, all over the world and not just in those places. We even see a certain element of that in South Africa, although perhaps a little less so. But we could even characterize Ramaphosa's claims of returning the ANC to kind of its original mission are really the forces of conservatism and reactionary forces trying to get back to the tradition of who we are. So for better and for worse, we will see plenty of that. Let's zoom in on South Africa. Of course, this is an election year, so that's the main focus of what we're interested in. And to remind you, once we know the date, I'll be able to get a much more accurate look at the election itself. Right now, I can really only talk about the year in general, and what that really seems to be showing for us. Despite the rest of the world facing a build-up of very reactionary forces that is going to lead to greater pain and suffering in the long run, South Africa is actually looking a little bit better than that. And for 2019 and into 2020, we see increasing efforts to find peace. We are part of the build-up of aggression in the world. We don't get to escape the world that we're in, but we can really see a strong focus on conversation and attempts to find solutions, something that also represents a tradition that South Africans would lay claim to. Mostly, it looks like this will lead to more peaceable and acceptable resolutions to some of the matters about land or other matters that are brought into both the parliament and the justice system. For the most part, this year looks good for our justice system and our parliament, not surprisingly, especially in the second half of the year. We've been told the election is May. Astrology is independent of political announcements, but it's remarkable in the South African charts how much actually changes from June on and how little actually changes before then. There is no doubt that there is a very strong focus on land matters in the first half of the year. There are, it's remarkable even just to see the charts that both the great big important cyclical planets that I've been talking about and the planets of the year all fall in South Africa's house of land and property, and that's also the house of agriculture. So we can see a tremendous focus on that, and although simple common sense tells us there will continue to be a lot of disagreement and fear around that, it's important to know that in the latter part of the year it looks good. It looks like we can lead to resolutions and solutions and other things like that. So don't lose faith. There are ways, and there is a way that we're going to find how to sort this out better. There is no doubt that it needs to be sorted out. The charts actually identify land as the crisis point. The cosmos agrees that that is the break point, that if we don't sort that out, we haven't moved this country forward. So we actually need to find a common place, a place where we can negotiate better or understand each other's solutions better, accept the solutions better, and find a way that looks good. From the chart's point of view, it must be stressed that the process looks very legal. So for those who are afraid of land grabs and sudden radical changes by the current government, that doesn't look at all likely in the next few years. It looks like a peaceable, legal way will increasingly be found. And for the most part, that applies to things other than land as well. It's just a great year for finding better ways to sort out our problems. So it looks like the election is a little bit of the catharsis that we need. Literally right up to June, it's the touch and go of electioneering and election politics that really reach a fever pitch in April, as you would expect. You don't need an astrologer to tell you, but to me it's remarkable that the chart shows it so clearly that there is so much misinformation and pretty much info chaos in the month of April, and we need to look out for other kinds of chaos as well. April is a very edgy month, and there could very well be violence leading up to the election, that is especially during that month of April. But during the months that follow the election, the June to September period, we can see a lot of adjustment and realignment. And there's a lot of adjustment and realignment especially happening in the opposition politics. It's, we're not in a position yet to predict astrologically any outcomes for the election because we don't have a date for the election yet. It does look like there's a complete realignment in opposition politics, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Democratic Alliance does considerably worse than they expect. And the reason I say that is because the chart shows surprises and upheavals and reversals in opposition politics. But what we also see in that middle of the year period is tremendous challenge to the president and the government. It really looks like within his own party or amongst his own enemies or something like that, there can be a really strong reaction to the events of May. And you know, if I was in Cyril Ramaphosa's circle, I would say, sir, be very careful in the months of June and July. It really looks scary for you. It's not necessarily something like physical violence, but it's something that looks really scary. So, in other words, let's put it that perhaps he's been opposing all the appeasing all these opposing forces within the ANC and doing his amazing, charming way of maintaining peace with everyone while holding his cards very close to his chest. That looks like in June there is reaction to him from his own party. Commentators expect that after the election he can start really showing his hand. Maybe it's a reaction to that, but all I can see is that it's a very touch and go period for the president around about June. I'm interpreting the events of June as more chaos happening around him than him actually causing those upheavals. Probably a little bit of both, and that's why there's so much reaction within his party, and there's a lot of uncertainty and a few earthquakes in the ANC in the immediate aftermath of the election. Something else that might be a little bit stabilizing, but rapidly leads to improvement by the late part of the year. Right through August, so June, July, August is an incredibly touch and go, changey kind of time. We'll see lots of positive advances after the election, but we'll also see lots of negative ones. It's not going to magically solve problems, and we're still going to see a lot of conflict as a result of that election, most likely within the ANC or in its world. But soon after that, by the time we reach the later months, October and especially November, we're on a much more solid track. And that solid track could lead to a lot more financial stability in the late part of the year. In the early part of the year, it does not look like it. In fact, in the early part of the year, money outflowing, corrupt money, money that shouldn't be spent, all those things we saw under the Zuma government and that we thought were over will continue to show, and probably still some of the after effects. This could be related to Eskom, could be related to discovery of other stolen or invisible money along the way that we as yet did not know about. But gradually it looks like that's also balanced. Ramaphosa has successfully managed to attract a lot of investment money in 2018, and it looks like he's going to manage to do the same in 2019. There's lots of money coming in. There's also important work being done on the land issue that causes a lot of the fear and uncertainty in the early part of the year that, as I said, won't be there in the later part of the year. What we also see after the election in the central part of the year and the later part of the year is a very strong reassertion of South Africa's identity. The middle and later parts of the year, it'll very much feel like this is more the South Africa we know or we want. This isn't a magical turnaround. We must remember this is a process, and there's still a lot of the aggression, uncertainty and difference that exists. Astrology does not act in a vacuum. As I said right at the beginning, we're not going to magically all start just loving each other and agreeing with each other. What is important is that the climate is right for us to reach the place we have reached before in this country, where we can reach points of agreement and we can reach solutions where we have actually done that before. From my point of view, looking at these charts, that's really the lesson of 2019, that it really is, we know that we have done this before. We know that even if it was not perfect, the negotiations that led to the democratic state were unprecedented and so unbelievably unlikely that no one could ever imagine such a thing could happen. If we remember that, we know that we are pretty easily equipped to deal with the differences and lingering problems and new problems that perhaps were papered over that have emerged now. And that's why the land issue or any other issue, we must go forward without fear, with knowledge that we can find ways to solve these problems that are beneficial for most South Africans, because we know we've done that before, and we can see here these are possible. We are actually finding ways to look forward, and in the late part of the year, because of our improved financial situation and improved image, we are really finding a way to go forward. You know, history shows us that to a large extent South Africa is outside of the main firing line of the major wars that happen in the world. We've been drawn into it because we were a colony. So the colonial powers, of course, draw on colonies for cannon fodder. So that happened, of course, in the previous wars. But that won't happen in this war because this is an independent country. History suggests that this is a time, 2020, of actual violence and conflict and oppression and totalitarianism, something we can see building in the world. But as I say, South Africa, a little bit out of that loop. And fortunately, with our improvement towards the end of the year, possibly so. Not so much necessarily the rest of the world. Looks a little bit scary for Theresa May, who astrologically looks likely to be losing her job sometime soon, and for the United Kingdom itself, which looks increasingly embroiled in what I imagine might also be something similar to trade wars or trade conflict in the latter part of this year and early next year. So that seems to be at least one of the post-Brexit effects. In all the compromises they are not reaching, but suggesting in the UK situation, whatever happens as a result of that looks astrologically like it leads to a lot of difficulties and complications next year, early next year in trade, and a lot of aggression and fighting around that. And as I say, in the American situation, it looks like Donald Trump is keeping his job this year, but next year he might be taking his country to war. We're going to talk more about next year when the time comes. But we need to understand that we are living in a time where we will witness the build-up of powerful forces. That's 2019. While we might not be directly in the firing line, we can expect to be somewhat affected by that. It's important that astrology, in its understanding that history is a cycle, not an arrow, reminds us not to despair. It proves and shows us that every war is followed by every peace, that the conflicting forces which produce war, which produce change, and which threaten our lives so much are actually the process of history unfolding. And we are part of that. We must own that. Remember, if we're expecting everything to be completely resolved and we're finished with wars and everyone's happy, we would be talking about the end of history, because history would deny everything I just said. And the end of history would be the end of the world, because history is everything since a minute ago that ever happened. And we can't end history. It continues to happen. And that's what we must bear witness to and realize we witness to the tremendous process of the human experience. We don't want to be naive and say it's a process leading to love, beauty and harmony, because history doesn't agree with that. And it doesn't seem likely anyway. And spiritually, well, that doesn't seem likely either. That's the subject of another talk on this show. But importantly, that we must let go of the idea of suddenly everything is crashing to an end, or suddenly everything is going to be resolved. In those great big cycles of history, we are challenged to change. We are challenged to accept change or to change, but it's always about change. And if we accept what we cannot control as changing and focus on ourselves, we're able to negotiate and navigate these changes in the best possible way. For the most part, 2019 is looking like a challenging year and the build-up of a challenge for the world. But for South Africa, it continues to offer opportunities to move us forward as a country and as a collective of what do we want for the future. For us in South Africa, 2019 is a difficult but clear step forward. So, while our friends the Stoics would remind us that hope is pretty much a useless emotion, we do have reason for it. We know that we mustn't be naive about the difficulties we face leading up to the election, and nor that the election will produce some magic result. That we can see that there's a lot of putting it back together. But even removing it from politics, and I'm not saying a political opposition, those of us who agree or disagree with each other or with the government policy, this year, by the end of it, is about finding new ways to shake hands when we disagree, like we learned in 1994, but new ways to actually make things happen. If we understand that the world is preparing itself for increasing drama and chaos in the years ahead, then maybe we can be a beacon of light like we have been before in 1994. When the world needed hope, it once looked to us. The world is going to need hope again, and we might be in a position to offer it by saying there are ways to do this without tearing each other's throats out. So 2019, we're going to get ourselves to the point where we're going to show them how. Remember to tune in every month when I look at the month ahead, including politics, and of course as we get close to our own election, for more detail and more clarity about what that will entail. And of course join me next week when I look at your stars and